Well, hello and a very warm welcome to the CBI Conference on International Trade. We're broadcasting from ITN here in the centre of London. I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Sherard Cooper-Coles from the China-Britain Business Council, by Joe Hawley, Consul General for Guangzhou and South China, by Guy Drury, Chief China Representative from the CBI, and finally by Patrick Horgan from Rolls-Royce. Well, a very warm welcome to all of you. Now, together, we're going to be exploring the opportunities and challenges, of course, for the China-UK trading relationship in what I think we can all agree is something of a changed landscape. A brilliant lineup. I'm very much looking forward to the next 50 minutes or so, and thank you all for joining me today. Guy, I'd like to start with you, just with, if you can give us an assessment of how you view this most critical relationship, the China-UK trading relationship.
Daisy, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to you all from Beijing. The UK, along with the rest of the world, is facing up to the reality of a rising China in ways that perhaps seemed inconceivable only weeks or months ago. Although the so-called golden era of UK-China relations seems to be now long forgotten, the facts remain that there are significant opportunities for UK business in China. Here in Beijing, at the annual China Auto Show, I saw the boardings, the advert billboards advertising Jaguar Land Rover. Down in South China as well, in Shenzhen, British fashion giant Burberry has been experimenting with a brand new interactive store incorporating WeChat and Chinese social media to entrance and entice in Chinese consumers to buy British brands. And more than 100 British universities, schools and educational establishments are welcoming back many of more than the 136,000 Chinese students who generate close to £2 billion in revenue for the UK economy. As our Director General, Dame Carolyn Fairbairn, outlined in an op-ed earlier in the year, there needs to be a clear-eyed and pragmatic approach taken to the challenges and opportunities that China presents, both to the UK business community in particular and UK society in general. Engagement must be based on facts and not hearsay. And the UK, in collaboration with other like-minded countries, needs to continue to push for an open, level playing field across a range of regulatory and market access issues, whilst reminding China too to abide by the rules-based global trading order. Taking a long-term and consistent view of the new China emerging in this most extraordinary of years is the best way forward for UK-China relations. And now back to you, Daisy. Thank you.
Guy, thank you so much. And Joe, as Guy started off by quoting that George Osborne quote of this was going to be the golden decade or the golden era of Chinese and British relationships. And it hasn't quite worked out that way in some ways, but in other ways, it's a relationship that's extremely healthy. How would you categorise it?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would agree that it's long forgotten. That has definitely laid really very strong foundations, both at kind of working levels and governments, but also for businesses taking advantage of the opportunities that relationship has delivered. It is a very important bilateral relationship. It's very broad. It delivers significant benefits for both sides. We see China as an important global partner. We work together on international trade, as you've mentioned, but also, of course, on other areas that are important to us. And China is a huge player in these areas, such as climate change. In terms of bilateral trade, last year, for the first time, it went above £100 billion. And that shows how significant it is for the UK, but also for China. And for Chinese investors, they still see the UK as their location of choice in Europe. So really important for the Chinese side as well as ours. That's not to say we always agree, and we have been, as government, calling China out on areas where we are concerned with our international partners. We've made statements on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, for example. But when you talk to UK companies here, it's actually not UK-China relationships that they're talking about at the moment. It's the impact of COVID. It's the impact of US-China relations on supply chains for them. So those are the types of things that the UK-China relations that we are here to support, is where we are helping in very practical ways.
Joe, thank you. So, Sharon, if I can come to you, you've almost got two hats in this game. You've got a former diplomat's hat where you can view the relationship from that diplomatic angle, and of course, a business hat now. And when you look at the relationship, obviously, again, there are stresses and strains there. There's the diplomatic stresses and strains, but there's the healthy business relationship. What sort of school report would you give it?
Well, I'd echo the views of the wily old Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, who said that in any relationship you need to seek common ground while acknowledging your differences. And as Zhou said, there are political differences, but the business of business is business on both sides of this equation. Post-COVID, post-Brexit, Britain will have three large economic partners. The EU, where there'll be more friction in the relationship, whatever happens at the end of the year, the US, and then our third largest economic partner by far, and the one with the biggest upside by far again, will be China. So we need to engage with China in terms of exports of goods, which were up 30% in 2019, of services where we have a surplus, the pipeline of inward investment, tourism. Guy's already mentioned the well over 100,000 Chinese students at British universities. It's a huge relationship for both sides, and we would be completely mad to decouple ourselves from the potential of China in the post-COVID, post-Brexit world.
So given that I think I can say most people don't want to see a decoupling, but they're not quite sure how the best way forward is.
Well, the best way forward, and this has been shown in research, is to separate the political differences from the economic and practical engagement, the people-to-people engagement, the business-to-business engagement, the university-to-university engagement. And that's what at CBBC we're trying to promote. It's what Jo and her team are trying to do across southern China, remembering that that's got an economy the size of California's. You know, this is vast. 800 million people lifted out of poverty, the world's largest middle class. And it's all upside for Britain. And for small SMEs, they can now export into China over the internet, sell their products on e-platforms, and make vast sums of money in the end.
Well, talking of making vast sums of money, I want to come to Patrick. Patrick, from your point of view, from Rolls-Royce's point of view, what is the business relationship like?
Well, it will very much depend what kind of business you're in. In our case, we have a very long history working with China. We have seen ups and downs in that relationship and are well accustomed to those changes. And the fact of the matter is that for the civil aerospace sector, whether you spoke to Boeing or to Airbus or to us or to our immediate competitors, the fact is that China takes close to 25% of Boeing and Airbus's global production. And therefore, clearly, it is an extremely important market now and into the future. It very much depends on the different segments of business that you're in, but it's clear that, as Sharon has indicated, this is a large, important business relationship for the UK and for many UK corporates.
Patrick, obviously intellectual property is very important for a lot of companies, but it's a particularly tricky area when dealing with China. What's your experience of that? And do you have any advice to some of our viewers today, some in our audience, about how to negotiate that area?
Well, technology and innovation is absolutely central to our business. We're the UK's leading issuer of patents, and we are understandably very protective of our IP. It's important to note that although IP is key to our business, it's not just our business. And in fact, if you look at a consumer goods or luxury goods business, many businesses have IP at the core of what they do, and many of them actually are in a way more exposed and vulnerable to IP abuse than we are. At least we can keep the design process very distinctly separate. There are high barriers to entry, and we can be protective and effectively protective of our IP in a way that is hard for some other companies to do. If you are in the consumer space, it's definitely the case that over the years there have been improvements in the IP environment in China, and increasingly you can use the domestic court system to pursue IP challenges. And beyond that, if you're talking about the protection of key technologies, obviously the most sure way to avoid a problem is simply to avoid exposing those key technologies within China.
Yeah, so keeping a lid on that. Joe, I can see you were nodding through Patrick's answer to that. Any reaction to that? Obviously, you're speaking to us from China today. Any reaction to what Patrick was saying there?
Yeah, just picking up on the intellectual property point, here in South China, we have a huge tech hub for here in Guangdong. Shenzhen gets all the headlines, but actually throughout Guangdong, some really impressive tech, but also that burgeoning middle class in China and the amount of consumer goods that Patrick also mentioned, really a huge market. And we see more and more UK companies coming in to tap into that market. And through the courts and through the messages at the highest levels of leadership in the Chinese government, intellectual property protection is becoming more and more important, not least because the Chinese companies themselves now have a vested interest in this. Previously, if we were talking kind of 30 years ago, the Chinese companies were much more interested in kind of what they could take from elsewhere, in terms of the fake Mulberry bags that we used to kind of see everywhere. Whereas now the Chinese companies have their own designers, they have their own tech that they're protecting, their own intellectual property. So there is much more of a vested interest from their side to get their systems right to protect those areas.
Guy, coming back to the UK, and obviously we are jostling with other countries. British companies are jostling and competing against other European countries or global countries to get a bit of that Chinese market. How are we doing comparatively?
Well, if we look at the bilateral relationship, Daisy, I mean, first and foremost, the UK is the largest recipient of Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe, and by a good country mile, I think, as well. We are China's third largest trading partner. I beg your pardon, the UK is China's third largest trading partner, and we're the second largest source of imports, or we were in 2019. Sherrod already mentioned the surplus with services. Equally, we were shipping goods to China totaling more than £32.4 billion in 2019. There is no room for complacency, though. Whilst we have built this relationship, I think if we were to look closer to the region that Joe and I are in, if we look around Northeast and Southeast Asia, there are many other countries, particularly in the ASEAN region, that would be keen to be snapping at the heels of some of UK business brands, etc. So it's important to keep a perspective. But in terms of where we are and where we've been for a good 3 to 5 years now, particularly in such a wide-ranging area of sectors, we're just talking about education, brands, some of the larger sectors. There's still huge room for growth, particularly financial services and in media and tech, should the China market open. Thank you.
So, Sherrod, obviously we've been talking about China specifically, but is there a sense, do you think, that some British companies are shifting their attention away from China to other areas of the South Pacific?
Well, I wouldn't say it's either or, Daisy. It's both and. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of growing interest in Southeast Asia, in Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea. But the China market remains the most important. I think it was Santander did a survey the other day which showed that 20% of British businesses are more committed to China than ever. And that's a far larger percentage than for the rest of Asia.
I suppose sometimes there might be, if companies are perhaps dipping their toe into this market, they're not that experienced and they're trying to work out how best to do business. There might be a danger that they'll think one size fits it all when you're talking about the region. And in fact, many people have told me that that's not the case at all, that some business customs and manners and ways to do things can vary greatly from country to country.
Yes. Well,
culture to culture.
No, well, exactly, Daisy. It is a difficult market, particularly people who are new to China. So that's why, working with DIT, we have our new to China exporter services, where we have Launchpad, China Navigator, all these different services that guide small businesses, unlike the Rolls-Royces of this world, who've no China experience, but have huge amounts to gain from the China market. I'm thinking of one of our members, a small cosmetics manufacturer in the middle of the English Midlands, who's now exporting to China vast quantities, using these services to leap over the logistical and other barriers into the China market.
Yeah. Patrick, I wonder just on this point of business culture, whether there are things you've learned and maybe practical advice you could give to how do's and don'ts of this trading relationship.
I think don't go into the discussion with Chinese counterparts with preconceptions. Keep an open mind. Recognize that very often the assurances that there's no problem at all are polite ways of glossing over problems, and therefore do your homework, apply your critical faculties relentlessly to the realities in front of you, and make sure you really understand the situation, the people you're dealing with, the dynamics. It's an environment that rewards hard work, close scrutiny, and making sure you really understand your operating environment.
And Guy, as far as from your perspective, when you're advising members and clients as this relationship, are there things that you've learnt over the years of business cultural do's and don'ts, or any mistakes that you've seen that we could all learn from?
I think I really do have to echo what Patrick was saying. You mustn't go into either a business relationship or a business opportunity in a sort of fixed A to Z manner. Inevitably, what you started out with will not be the finished product. And having that sort of flexibility of mindset, having that ability to think on your feet, to be a good businessman or a good business lady, but equally also to see perhaps you're getting in too deep and things aren't going quite the way you're expecting. So to always have, I think, at the same time, a little bit of an exit strategy when required. Those would be some key do's and don'ts from me. Thank you.
And guys, so Sherrod and I we're talking about other areas in the regions, other nations in the regions, but we haven't touched on Hong Kong yet, and how obviously Hong Kong, crucial part relationship with the UK, a difficult relationship recently. What would your advice be? Because when a lot of businesses have historically used Hong Kong as a launch pad.
Yes. Well, my advice, my comment on this would be very much it's kind of business as usual, but as I was saying in opening remarks, but being clear-eyed about some of the realities of what's happening in Hong Kong right now. But in a business perspective, it is still very much a launch pad for South China, to that Californian-sized economy of Guangdong province alone. There is still English rule of law that can be applied, and English language is still very important for businesses. And I think, and this will come out perhaps in further conversations, but with the Greater Bay Area, I think ourselves, our friends and colleagues at the China Written Business Council, the Chambers of Commerce, particularly in South China, do see the Greater Bay Area initiative as a huge sort of extra stepping stone for Hong Kong. And finally, I mean, Hong Kong's sort of geographical presence is the sort of the pearl of the Orient, if you like, in South China. It is still the entry point. It is still the hub and spoke for Southeast Asia as well. And we've seen many secondary listings by Chinese companies in the last few weeks and months. And with its financial services excellence and sort of proximity to a large and burgeoning market, it still remains an incredibly important launchpad for UK businesses. Thank you.
Joe, Guy was just mentioning the Greater Bay Area there, very much your patch, and from where you're talking to us today. What are the opportunities that you see or you advise on for collaboration in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. In my previous role, I was Director of Trade and Investment in our consulate in Hong Kong, and so enjoyed 4 years working with hundreds of UK companies who have regional hubs there. There are thousands of UK companies who do business through Hong Kong, and actually coming up into South China, you're kind of surprised that there's actually so few of them who've made the kind of step over the border and come into South China. A number of them go up to Beijing, up to Shanghai, and actually the kind of next big opportunity is here in South China. We've already mentioned tech as a huge part of this area. The large spending power of the middle classes that's developing here now opens opportunities for education, healthcare. We've just had 9 UK schools companies open institutions this month in South China. And so really some very impressive opportunities. The key one really is financial services, because obviously that's a huge piece of work for us in Hong Kong, large numbers of companies that are focused on financial services in Hong Kong, and the GBA and other policies such as the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement that is between Hong Kong and China give those companies in particular opportunities to take that step across the border. And we've seen a number of UK fintech companies in that area making the most of it in particular. So definitely still a major launch pad, and those preferential policies do really help.
Great. So, Sherrod, we've had a few mentions so far about the number of Chinese students coming to universities in the UK. It's the numbers are quite staggering. It's a huge proportion, and I wonder what your opinion is on that as a business model, but also now that we have problems with obviously COVID and universities, how the knock-on of that might be to the investment that we, the UK, are getting from China.
Well, I think it's very important, Daisy. It's about 5% of the income of the British higher education sector.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely huge. And as Joe implied, it's not just Chinese students coming to the UK. It's also British universities, schools, colleges setting up in China. And I would think of this not just in terms of the revenue to British universities, but we're educating a generation of Chinese in British values, British education systems. They are friends for life. They are the future of China. And the fact that more and more of them are coming to Britain is a huge asset for us.
But is there not a danger that, sorry to interrupt, that we might be putting all our eggs in one basket? And given that a number of these students won't be able to fulfill their degrees, and that money source that universities are getting might dry up, then a lot of those universities are going to be in big financial trouble. Well,
there is that risk, but it's amazing how it's being mitigated. I mean, some universities are chartering their own aircraft to bring the students over. I mean, the news from the universities is that most of the Chinese students have turned up, and those who haven't are studying online. So, we need to be vigilant. Obviously, we don't want, our particular secrets and cyber security or whatever it may be being stolen. But in many of these areas, we have Chinese students who are the best of the best. We gain, they gain, and we invest in the future relationship.
And given what a success the university sector has made of that relationship, are there lessons to be learnt, do you think, from what they did attracting Chinese students for other industries or other sectors?
Yes, big lessons. I mean, first of all, get out to China, get on the ground, market yourself. Exactly what Guy and Patrick said, be open, be flexible, don't have a fixed business model. And picking up the point you asked Patrick about, realize that in many of these areas, the intellectual property the Britain of the future needs is Chinese, not British. I mean, of course, we need to be concerned about China stealing our intellectual property, but we also need to realize that in many of these areas, high-speed rail, autonomous mobility, batteries, artificial intelligence, China is now leading the world. Exactly as Joe said, it used to be China copying Mulberry bags or whatever it may be. Now China is an innovation hub, particularly in high technology, that Britain needs to benefit from. So, subject to safeguards, we need to welcome Chinese investment, build on this relationship in post-COVID, post-Brexit Britain's interest.
Well, you mentioned Brexit. Obviously, it's a huge issue, and I do want to talk about that in a minute. We've touched on COVID, but not in any great depth. But the one area that nobody's mentioned so far, which is clearly a very big issue in this area, is Huawei, and what the implications of that relationship that then has obviously gone sour a bit. And what are the ramifications of that?
Well, luckily, the government, and it's not for me to criticize government policy, and I'm afraid a lot of this may have more to do with domestic politics than it does with a cold-eyed analysis of security. But we are where we are. Huawei is committed to this country. They're doubling down on their investment in research here. They'll be a very important part of the UK non-core telecommunications network for a long time to come. And in many of these 5G technologies, they have no real competition. I'm afraid in some of the debates there was more heat than light. And, I just echo what Carolyn Fairbairn said, Guy's repeated. In many of these debates, we need evidence, we need facts, we need a cool-headed, clear-eyed appreciation of where the British interest lies. And on Huawei, I mean, the estimates are that the decision that was really, in some ways, imposed on the government by the House of Commons will cost us about £18 billion and delay the rollout of 5G by 2 years. Now, if that is really what national security dictates, so be it, but there are many people who are not convinced.
Joe, can I come to you for sort of a diplomatic response to what Sir Sherrod just said?
Yeah, well, as we've made very clear to the Chinese authorities and publicly, this was an independent technical assessment which made it very clear that the US sanctions made the supply chains for Huawei's involvement in our 5G network incompatible. It wasn't possible, therefore, for us to continue with that work with Huawei, but there are a number of other projects that we work with Huawei. So Sherrod mentioned that there's a number of areas of investment that Huawei do in the UK. They are committed to those. We continue to work with those. It's very few areas that in the end actually pose any sorts of question around what is the implications and are there potentially implications for national security or our domestic interests. There's huge amounts where we can collaborate and we continue to do so. And of course, at a working level, we continue to work with a number of projects.
And Patrick, from a business perspective, when these issues arise, whether it's Huawei, whether it's diplomatic relations, how does that affect you?
There is a large amount of business that, unless you reach the point where there is some very profound rupture in the relationship, will continue regardless, because it is clearly in the interests of both sides for it to do so. And therefore, we can often see periods, moments of friction and change in the relationship without it necessarily having significant impact on day-to-day operations or on commercial performance. That said, it's clearly a better scenario if we reach some kind of new equilibrium in the relationship, and this moment of uncertainty and the dynamism associated with the fresh scrutiny around China is a moment that we view through the rear view mirror rather than something that we have to contemplate ahead of us without knowing exactly what does lie ahead. So it is ideal if you have a stable and predictable bilateral relationship that provides a good context for business operations to run within, but recognizing that cannot always be the case, that we have to distinguish between those things that may be vulnerable to political risk and many other activities that continue regardless.
And Guy, presumably that's very much where the CBI positions itself.
Very much. I think the theme, our sort of mandate for having an operation out here in China covering the region too, is to sort of stick well beyond individual frictions between countries, but most importantly act as a glue, as a bridge between businesses and as Sherrod was saying earlier, particularly on the people-to-people dialogue, making sure engagement continues. And on that note, looking just a month ahead to the CIEE, the China International Import and Export Expo taking place in Shanghai, there's more than, I think, 240 British companies and brands signed up for that. And at the same time, we've been getting quite a few encouraging inquiries from member companies across the northeast of England. One example would be a company based in that's got an operation out in Chengdu, looking at trying to sell its tech to AI tech to the auto sector in southwest China. So yes, our position is very much to focus on the practical, to see where we can support, but equally to stand up for what UK business stands for, which is transparency, rule of law, long-term relationships, but doing it in a pragmatic way and based from here on the ground. Thanks.
And so, Sherrod, the other thing or person we haven't mentioned is Donald Trump. But obviously that US-China trade war is something that we're all watching. How does that affect us?
Well, it doesn't affect us directly, but as Joe said, the reason given for the U-turn on Huawei was the American decision on chips. And, we are affected when America seeks to take action. So we need, as best we can, to insulate the British-China relationship. We need to pursue our own interests in a clear-eyed, sort of level-headed way. And remember that, there are many in America who are continuing to trade with China. The big American banks are actually expanding their presence in China. A recent survey by of the American Chamber of Commerce members in Beijing showed that 70% of them had no plans to change their posture in China. So I'm afraid there is some double standards in the American approach. You have the sound and fury in Washington and in both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, but the reality is something like 1/5 of America's imports still come from China. 2 years later, I think it's down to 18% from 20%, something like that. There's been a 2% reduction in Trump's time as president. So America and China are still very closely linked. And I was with a couple of Tory MPs last night, one of whom's a major critic of China. But there is actually common ground for all their worries in the Tory party about security. All but the most sort of hard line of them agree that Britain and China have major economic interests in common. And then picking up Joe's point, which is so sensible, there's no global problem in the world today that can be solved without China, whether it's climate change, public health, the rules-based trading system. Britain is a permanent member of the Security Council. We need to work with our Chinese friends and partners. And the Prime Minister himself, I mean, you talk to him privately, he believes, as I do, as I'm sure Guy and Patrick and Joe do as sinologists, that China is a great civilization. It's a great country. And for Britain to cut itself off from this country at this moment in human history would be an act of enormous folly. So it needs great agility, great political skill. It needs more facts in the debate in Parliament, particularly in the Conservative Party, where there's a lot of emotion and, I'm afraid, a lot of ignorance. And we need to get the facts out about the jobs that this creates right across this United Kingdom.
And just coming back to the US-China trade war, obviously we're only a matter of weeks away from the American election. What would the knock-ons be of a Biden administration versus another Trump administration in the Chinese relations?
Very good question, Daisy. And I mean, it's not for me to comment on American politics, though I did spend 4 years in our embassy there following it. I mean, I think when Biden actually first stood for president, but I think we'd be foolish to think that the tensions are going to subside. It may be less volatile if Biden is elected, and it's by no means certain that Biden will be elected, but the underlying sense of competition, of American anxiety about the rise of a great competitor will remain, and it's bipartisan, and it extends well beyond Washington. But as I said, that doesn't prevent America from continuing to trade on a very substantial scale with China, and it's particularly frustrating to see American firms increasing their share of the Chinese market at the time when their political leaders are saying the things they're saying about
Sticks
China.
in the throat somewhat, I'm guessing, for some observers. Patrick, if we can come back to your experiences, and particularly as we look towards the end of the year and Brexit, and what impact will the various scenarios that we could be facing have to businesses like yours that do a lot of business in China?
When you are in China and this topic comes up, frankly, it seems rather remote. The reality is that for much of the trade that exists between UK corporates and China, Brexit is not a topic that impedes on that in any meaningful way. So I think the issue is probably less to do with the pragmatic concerns around trade, tariffs, quotas, friction at the border with Europe, things that matter in other discussions, and more around the UK's place in the world. And I think that clearly that is something that is still to be determined at this point. And China watches and observes that with interest. Sharon summed it up neatly at the beginning by saying that the UK's three main trading partners and big blocks that we have to deal with will be the US, the EU, and China. When you view it from China, clearly it's a world where there are three big blocks, and the UK is no longer one of those blocks. So it is a changed set of circumstances for us. It's less to do with some of the other discussions around Brexit that you hear in the UK context. It's remote from China, but nevertheless people observe it and they wonder what it means long term for the UK's place in the world.
Don't we all? Joe, if I can come on to you. A question about businesses that might want to influence UK-China policy. If they do, what's the best way and the best arguments for doing that?
Certainly from a UK government point of view, we really want to make sure that we're listening to business all of the time. And as the organisations that were represented here today know, we've run a number of consultations recently. And you've put in your opinions, we see you frequently. And sometimes it's about ministers or officials meeting with businesses to be up to date with their particular issues. In other cases, it is organisations like CBI, China Britain Business Council, chambers engaging with us. But really also important that if you're looking at particular markets to export to, or you're active in those markets, to link in with your local mission, and particularly the Department for International Trade people, because we have sector specialists there who can help you. So definitely keep those communication channels open. One of the other important ways in which businesses really can help the UK-China relationship is around being good ambassadors. And UK companies, like some of the big American companies that we've been referring to as well, are big investors here in China. They employ a lot of local people. They offer products and services that are important to the local population. And so they are really good ambassadors for their countries overseas. And that has an influence as well on the Chinese government, making sure that those companies are looked after, whatever else is happening.
And Joe, when you say about being good ambassadors and showing good qualities, what are the qualities that the Chinese particularly appreciate that you notice there?
Well, for example, I was just up the coast from Guangzhou recently last week with a whole supply chain of UK offshore wind companies. And there is a big GE development that is being, a wind farm that is being developed there. And the GE had developed a very significant relationship with the local government. They had committed to research and development that was making a very high value investment for the local government. It's a huge opportunity for GE. It's a huge opportunity for the local economy, for the local people, for that local government. Also a huge opportunity for the UK, because as an offshore wind specialist, we have huge amounts of supply chain opportunities to put in there. So it's really kind of win-win-win for everybody involved.
Great, Joe, thank you so much. Patrick, quick question for you about UK competitors. How do you see them navigating political difficulties, and how does their approach perhaps compare to the UK?
Sorry, US competitors?
Yes.
Very interesting question, Daisy, and I think we've alluded to a little bit earlier in the conversation. Clearly, they are presented with challenging circumstances in Washington. The relationship has changed quite profoundly in terms of the politics. Frankly, this is something that people who've been observing the situation closely have anticipated. It's not a great surprise. China, for a long time, was a story of domestic opportunity within China. It didn't impede too much directly on our markets overseas. In the period post-financial crisis, that has changed. We've seen China investing significantly overseas. The politics has changed. And people recognize that there are some quite profound system incompatibilities between the way that China works and the way that the US and other developed Western countries work. And these system incompatibilities are being worked out in the politics right now. As we alluded to, it's also a bipartisan issue. And if you are a US company, particularly a US company operating in a high-tech strategic sector, or a sector with links to the defense establishment, you are in a place where you have to be very, very alert to those changed political currents. You have to recognize that the things that happen within China, that you do within China, are well separated from some of those other areas of activity. And the irony, as we alluded to, is that we continue to see some US competitors in an environment where domestically within the US they know the dialogue on China has changed, but nevertheless the operations within China continue to promote very strongly the strength, breadth, thickness of the relationship between those companies and the US and China. So I think we do have a little bit of a lag, and that's because it is an ongoing and unresolved discussion. And so in the meantime, it's perfectly rational that the companies involved will want to continue to pursue their business activities provided they stay within safe parameters. And that's what people will aim to do. It's not unusual for many companies that their largest market in the world will be the US, their second largest market will be China. That's true for US companies, it's true for many other European, UK multinationals. And in that environment, you have to be sensitive to the political currents, but recognize that prematurely cutting off or making some kind of binary choice between your first and second largest markets does not make good sense for anyone.
Guy, I wonder if that's something that that rings a bell with you, this sort of idea that perhaps there's a temptation to cut off your nose to spite your face, if I'm going to paraphrase Patrick there, and how that would impact the advice you give your members.
I go back to Sherrod's comment on it's both an and, not either or, and there's both opportunities for our members operating in China and continuing to do business into the new year in mainland Europe and of course with North America. I would also add that many of our members who have been approached in the last 6 to 9 months to say, by sort of outsiders, if you like, looking in to say, are you sort of tearing up your supply chains? Are you investing out of China? No, they're not, but they're also taking the Japanese approach, which is the sort of China plus one, meaning they are perhaps looking at how many eggs they have in the China basket, and they're looking for opportunities in the ASEAN region, perhaps, or in Northeast Asia, or further afield. So absolutely, I think the whole raison d'etre for all of our organisations, hopefully supporting UK business and UK PLC, is to offer these opportunities and to dance a careful dance that doesn't allow us to get in the way of sometimes the sort of fairly frenetic political environment that exists. Thanks, Daisy.
Picking up on Guy's last point there about this fairly frenetic political environment, and obviously, Joe, there are a lot of political uncertainties, but nonetheless, I'm going to ask you slightly to gaze into a crystal ball and say how you might see the UK-China relationship evolving, and looking at how it might evolve, how you would suggest businesses prepare for that evolution.
I think that our approach for government has been the same for a long time, that we want a broad relationship with China, and that if you are working together on issues of common interest, like global trade, like climate change, that gives you also a solid base for when there are disagreements, because there's very few countries around the world that we disagree, that we agree on everything. And so when there are issues, and of course there are issues at times with China, we then have a voice, we have an opportunity, we have a seat in the room to be able to kind of have those conversations. So I think that will continue, that we will continue to want to have that broad-based relationship. Global trade is without China is just not possible. So engaging with China will continue to be really important, but not just for the trade objectives, but for the whole broad base of what we want to achieve here.
Joe, thank you very much. Final thought from you, Sir Sherard.
Well, final thought is I think we're all agreed that we need a trading relationship with China that acknowledges there may be political differences. And I'd like to appeal to the members of the CBI who are watching this that if you feel there is a stake in this relationship, please quietly remind your Member of Parliament, the politicians you know, that this relationship matters for jobs across the United Kingdom, because the problem isn't so much the civil service, the officials, but quite a few politicians, for understandable reasons, are worried about China. There's a very frenetic debate, as several of us have said, inside the Conservative Party and beyond about China. And what we need to do as business people is quietly get across the facts to the political class, to the politicians, to the members of the cabinet about why this matters for the prosperity of the country we all care about, the United Kingdom.
Lovely. So more cool, calm and collected you're calling for. Less heat and fury.
More common sense and an integrated review of overseas policy that has a sensible, balanced China chapter in it that keeps the economic relationship while allowing scope for difference on political issues, going back to Zhou Enlai, which is where we started.
Absolutely. Guy, I'm going to come to you for a final thought from the CBI's perspective.
Thank you very much indeed, Daisy. I think it's threefold. It's being practical. It's approaching China, the market, the opportunity in a pragmatic manner and in a flexible manner. It's really looking at sectors. We've talked about education. We've talked about high tech. We've talked about brands, financial services. I think it's finding those niches where we can support members and members can get in touch with us. And then it's that very important point that I think is at the heart of all of this, the bedrock, which is finding common ground. Where there are difficulties in the political relationship, it's making sure the business relationship is ever stronger. Similarly, people to people and business to business dialogue, they have to be the way forward. And final comment, I think I'd like to hope that we're all good ambassadors on this call, business, political or otherwise, but maintaining that sort of core optimism about the opportunities for UK in the world and China in the world, looking particularly into 2021 and beyond, is absolutely mission critical for us all. Thank you very much indeed, Daisy.
Well, thank you to all of you. I hope you agree with me that that was a really interesting discussion. A lot of ground covered, lots of practical advice given, and we didn't shy away from some of those big issues. I really look forward to seeing how, of course, that crucial relationship between China and the UK develops. And I'd like to thank, with very, very big thank yous to the panel, Sir Sherard, Joe, Patrick and Guy for joining me today. And of course, a big thank you to you for watching. Well, coming up next, we have a live discussion at 2 o'clock on the importance of a stable global trading system. Now, our panellists for that session will be Catherine Bennett from Airbus. Julian Braithwaite will be joining her, UK Ambassador to the World Trade Organization. Also, we'll hear from Catherine Graham of Darktrace, Rain Newton-Smith from the CBI, as well as Ben Osborne from Pfizer. Should be a great panel. See you then.